We're going to start. All right. Welcome to the October edition of our Gegenüber Talks presented by the Goethe-Institut North America. For those of you unfamiliar with our work, the Goethe-Institut is Germany's cultural institute operating worldwide with 6, soon to be 7 locations in the United States. Gegenüber is our digital transatlantic magazine, and tonight's event is part of our Literature Across Borders series. Before I turn the floor over to Paul and Paul for a discussion about the award-winning new translation of Karl Marx's Kapital, let me quickly introduce our speakers. Paul Reitter received his PhD in German studies from the University of California, Berkeley. For more than 20 years, he has taught in the German department at Ohio State University. He writes mainly about German Jewish culture, the history of the humanities, and translation. His work has been supported by fellowships from the American Academy in Berlin and the Guggenheim Foundation. Earlier this year, Paul received the prestigious Helen and Kurt Wolff Translators Prize for his translation of the first volume of Marx's Kapital, Critique of Political Economy, published by Princeton University Press last year. The co-editor of this new translation, Marx's Kapital, is none other than Paul North, Morris Nathanson Professor of German at Yale University. He teaches critical theory and has written several books, including Bizarre Privileged Items in the Universe, The Logic of Likeness, published by Zone Books in 2022, and the forthcoming The Standpoint of Marx's Kapital. There will be a brief Q&A after the talk, but you're welcome to write your questions into the chat as they come to you. And now I'm happy to hand it over to Paul and Paul. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Catherine, and for the invitation to be part of this great series. And thank you, people on Zoom here, for coming out tonight to listen to us and then talk with us.
Hi, everyone. It's confusing because we're both named Paul, but we figured it out, so we hope you can too. Paul, did you want to start?
Sure. Paul, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Good to see you. I'm doing pretty well, and I am always excited to talk with you about this book. We've been having these conversations for a long time, and yet they're always evolving, and that's been a great source of pleasure in my life these past 6 years or so. So, Paul, you wrote this great introduction to Volume 1, and I know it cost you a lot of effort. It's a difficult book to talk about. It does many different things. It's an unruly book in some ways. And I want to ask you to start, since the idea here is to, among other things, give a kind of introduction, to introduce your introduction a little bit. Pull out some of the key points and lay them out for us.
I'm happy to do that, and I really appreciate the opportunity. It's a really hard book, not just a hard book to introduce, and a hard book to translate, a hard book to edit, but a very hard book to read, which was something that Marx was aware of. The first chapter in particular is like a wall. You buy the book, you think you're going to learn about capital, and you're hit with a lot of technical vocabulary, a whole different way of viewing things, and it really can be quite forbidding. So my task in the introduction was to try to make some of it accessible. The first section of the introduction is called Marx's Anger, and I thought, given the amount of anger that's circulating in the world today, we could try to understand the way you take raw anger and refine it and develop it, which is something I take Marx to have done from his young years, in which he was really upset about the conditions in German-speaking lands. At that time, Germany was not unified. It wasn't a nation. It was, in his youth, 30 major principalities, Prussia being the most dominant one. And he was part of a liberalizing trend, or a tendency towards liberal freedoms, a desire for liberal freedoms, which would be freedom of the press, freedom of speech, some of the freedoms that are coming under attack in the US and in other places now. Before Marx was a communist or a socialist, he really was a liberal when being a liberal was a revolutionary position. So he started out angry at the way the upper classes or the nobles treated the lower classes or the paupers. He wrote a series of articles for the New Rhenish newspaper about wood theft in the forests of Rhineland. What was the problem? What made him angry? In this moment, what made him angry was the fact that gleaning rights, which were really useful for the people who lived there but didn't own the land, were being taken away. What are gleaning rights? The freedom, the ability to be able to pick up wood that had fallen in the forest without cutting anything down. And these were 100-year-old rights, many 100-year-old rights, and people depended on them. For,
yeah, this must be where the expression windfall comes from.
It's true, it was like a windfall, and it was for them a key source of income. They could heat their homes, they could cook their meals, they could make brooms and other tools out of the wood that they picked up out of forests owned by others. And partly because capitalism was beginning to come in and make those forests useful in a different way to the owners, and partly because there was a crackdown from the Prussian government. Those were being taken away, and Marx got upset, and he wrote a series of very, very strong articles against the practices of stealing what was free. How could you steal what's free? In a sense, that's at the center of all of capital. How can you steal what's free? The capitalists steal the labor from workers. But he hadn't developed that theory yet. This anger was kind of inchoate, was kind of directed at the law and kind of directed at the government. And over the next 20, 30 years, he refined that anger into a critique of the system that was coming in and dispossessing people in a more systematic way. That was capitalism. This is one of the elements of my introduction. Another element talks about the new thoughts that came out in this book. Marx himself lays them out. His main new thought in this book is that everything that looks like profit in the system derives from one particular new kind of substance, which he borrowed the name for from Ricardo, English political economist. Marx called it surplus value. And part of his analysis and part of the focusing of his anger is to show that all of the modes of profit are actually developed from surplus value, and surplus value is like the wood in the forests, stolen from the people who have the least. Another thing I try to talk about in the introduction are the ways that Marx thinks in order to show this system, which had never been shown in its entirety. Marx really was committed to showing it from soup to nuts, from workers making a product in the factory all the way up to finance, and he did this over 3 volumes. This one that's out now is just 1 volume, the first volume. I know that Paul Reitter is at work translating the 2nd volume. And in this big, long project, Marx brings some unusual ways of thinking into play. In order to understand how capitalism works, you have to understand, for example, the very unusual way of thinking that every simple thing in capitalism is complex, and every single thing in capitalism is actually double. So when you buy a good, like a hammer, which Marx calls, according to the parlance of the time, a commodity, it's really made up of 2 things, a use object and a value object. And they're put together, and they don't really go together. But this is one of the ways of thinking in uncomfortable doubles, in contradictory units, or units in tension with one another, that you have to learn in order to rebuild. I was wondering if we could move on at this point to talk a little bit about the translation project, unless you wanted to.
Well, I had one follow-up question, and that is, so you started out by emphasizing how difficult the book is, not simply how difficult the book is to talk about, but also how difficult the book is to read. You mentioned just now its length, which, certainly is forbidding in its own way, and then also this unusual way of thinking, looking at things in terms of doubling. Marx is very committed to the view that capitalism entails this doubling. Is there something else that that makes for challenges? And you've taught the book many times now. Is there have you noticed that there's a particular place in the book that students really seem to stumble over, where you seem to feel yourself be especially necessary as their teacher and guide?
Well, there's a lot of those places, as you know, too. I guess I would say something a little different, which is there's a place early, probably around chapter 4, where students get a great insight. And I think that's a powerful thing. So if you can get through chapter 1 and 2, you can get to chapter 4 or chapter 5, you discover that everything you've been learning about has another dimension, and that is that production, which is what volume 1 is about, making products, and workers making products, and capitalists being invested in making products in a factory on the production floor. That production is not just the production of products, but the creation of value. And he switches perspective at this moment to show that someone who is forging a hammer in a forge is also taking care of the value for the owners that they have used to purchase the raw materials, and adding new value by forming it into something else. And what the owner, the capitalist, is interested in is value. And then Marx shows the whole system backwards, not from the perspective of actually physically producing a commodity, but from the perspective of creating value, and how the physical production process and how workers become tools in the production of value. And that's really an eye-opening moment in the book. Do you find as well when you're teaching it?
Yes, definitely. Surplus value chapter is a big reveal moment, and coming after the long and, for many students, somewhat tedious money chapter, there's a thrill, but I think that there's a tendency also at that moment where things seem to come together, to feel as though, okay, now I've really got it, and not take into account some of the important things that Marx is saying about the primacy of value in this chapter, which turn out to be very important for the rest of the book, namely that value leads. There's a line by a later German Jewish author called Karl Kraus, that he developed in talking about the press, and how his idea was that the press, that should cover a reality that's to a large extent independent of it, has come to determine that reality. And so the idea for him is that we live in a situation where shadows throw bodies. And that line, I think, applies pretty well to capital too.
Is a good way of thinking about how value works, because it is a kind of shadow of the object that you might end up eating or using to make something, whatever that commodity is. But this shadow follows it and in effect leads it, which is what a lot of volume 1 is about, that the shadow value leads the body, the useful commodity. When you think about the challenges in translating this anew, and you think about the issue of value, which in fact the book has not really been recognized always as being mainly about value. It's been thought to be about workers, or history of the worker movement. It's been thought to be about, the mechanization of the workplace, and a lot that's all in there too. But it's all there to serve the explanation of what is the strange kind of entity, a strange mode of being that never existed before capitalism, that nobody knows to pronounce its name, and yet it pulls our strings like puppets. It is the shadow that throws our bodies. What were the challenges in trying to bring that version of the book to the fore?
Well, it made for a lot of interest in the language that Marx creates to express what value under capitalism is. So he, as you mentioned, he has new ideas in Capital around value, surplus value. There was a labor theory of value before Marx, and Marx thinks that some of the ideas that he's laying out theoretically were implied in what previous uh, theorists of capitalism said, but they didn't really make a concerted attempt to understand how value finally works. And that's what he's doing for the first time. They didn't distinguish between really between the concrete labor that produces the useful thing and what he thinks is the of as the abstract labor that is the substance that forms value. And just how that works is a very complicated, difficult thing, and there are debates about when exactly value comes into being for Marx. What is he saying? Does value come into being in the production process, or is it something that happens at the moment of exchange? Is it the process of is it the product of a process of abstraction where the individual qualities that make something useful are stripped away so that it can be made commensurable with other commodities and exchanged for other commodities? Marx thinks that he's the first to really name what this substance is, this social substance that constitutes value. And he comes up with a whole new language for describing it. The book is full of neologisms. And the previous English translations, they, for whatever reason, I mean, I can talk about why, but for now, I'll just say for whatever reason, they were not that interested in retaining the neologistic character of Marx's value terminology. And, that's a big loss when you have a
When you
term.
say neologistic, what do you mean? And can you give an example?
Sure. So Marx is making up new words to talk about this thing that hasn't been talked about before. So value is not a mental abstraction. It's not a physical thing either. It has an ontological status that's hard to determine. For Marx, it's very important that value has the same reality as a physical thing without being a physical thing. It's one of the reasons why, for him, people tend to naturalize value under capitalism, to see it as just something that is as um, self-evident, a part of our world as use values themselves, when for Marx, which we need in all societies, when in fact value under capitalism is peculiar to capitalism. And this whole situation, as we've said, is a kind of an upside down situation. And the unnaturalness of that is expressed by Marx in part through these very unnatural terms he uses to talk about value, one of which is value objecthood. So he's trying to talk about this particular status that value has, not a mental abstraction, not a physical thing, behaves like a physical thing, behaves like an object, even though it's actually in some ways the opposite of a physical object because it's immaterial. And he comes up with the term value objecthood. That doesn't exist in German before Marx. And if you read the earlier translations, English translations, you just don't get a sense of what Marx is trying to do here. Um, they use terms like reality or just value. That's in the first translation, the one from 1887, overseen by Engels. In a more recent Penguin translation, you have the objectivity of commodities as values, a paraphrase rather than an attempt to convey again, what Marx is doing here, the creativity he's bringing to this process, and also that he's trying to name something that he thinks no one has named before. That's a very exciting thing for him. It should it's potentially exciting for readers, but you don't get that excitement if you don't retain the neologism. And it also makes it more difficult, I think, to understand some of the uses of the term objective that come later in the fetishism section, where Marx talks about how the objective characteristics are reflected back at people, the objective characteristics of commodities. It's not clear what Marx is saying there if you've just been getting the language of objectivity, a fairly conventional use of that, a fairly conventional term. You have to get out of that in order to understand that Marx is not talking about the physical characteristics of these qualities, but he's talking about their special objective qualities as value objects.
So just to go back to that term, I'm interested in it. We've talked about it a lot.
Yes.
But it's worth unfolding a little bit. Here's one of the terms you encountered, which had something in the German that wasn't in the previous translations, value object. And you looked at it, and we looked at it, and we thought, well, why is this striving to do something different than even other existing German words? Why is he using a neologism? Why is he inventing a word? And it's because, and you can tell me if you think I'm right, that he's trying to make a distinction between, let's say, an object of use and the way that object becomes a carrier of value, let's say. So let's make the distinction just so people understand. Say you have a hammer. It's obvious what its uses are. It's used for, even if you use it for something it wasn't intended for, use it in an art project, you just stick it on the wall. You're still using the physical object for its physical qualities. But when it carries value, it is something that the owner of the hammer factory invests their money in, and it carries the value of that money all the way to the marketplace and returns money to them. So is the owner interested in the physical qualities of the hammer? Yes, but only because the physical qualities of the hammer are there to support the transportation of value to the market and back to the owner. So it has this second ghostly body, a value object that goes along with a use object that you don't really see, but the owner and the merchant are basically dealing in that object. They're dealing in the value object. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that's what I mean. For him, right? That's what he's saying. That they are they're trading when they trade a coat for two hammers. They are trading value objects, and the physical things. They are the necessary bearers and forms of appearance of value in this, but they're not the value itself. The value itself is objectified, abstract human labor, according to Marx. And there are lots of interesting complications here that have been debated again about exactly when value comes into being. But according to Marx, value, it does need a bearer. And Marx uses very often the language of value being contained in a commodity. Although there are some of the metaphors that Marx uses don't go along that well with some of his ideas about value, and so you can get into a little bit of trouble, I think, by holding on too much to a certain metaphor. Sort of like the idea that value is contained And a commodity suggests that there's like this kind of discrete, fantastic value object within the commodity that is not physical, but sort of existing on its own. However, that's not exactly the way Marx sees it, because as a social substance, all value is sort of connected, so that if the value of the commodity that is carrying the value changes, uh, uh, even I'm not putting this as clearly as I would like to, so Paul, feel free to jump in at any time, but that amount of value that's being carried by a commodity, it can change at any time. Not some like discrete thing existing on its own. Obviously, we know that the value of commodities, can go up or down after they've been made, after the certain amount of labor has been expended to make them. So sometimes, reading the way Marx is talking about value, it can sound as though value is some sort of, the value object is a kind of discrete object existing within the physical object. And Marx encourages that way of thinking by using terms like contains, but it's not as simple as that. And if you hold on too tightly to some of these metaphors, I think you can have trouble understanding different aspects of how this whole value thing works.
Well, I'm interested in the way you took or we took the level of this text about value and realized that it had been, obscured by previous translations. And so you recognize a neologism as a neologism and you work to make it make sense in English and convey something of the peculiarity of value. And there's a lot of ways that Marx stretches prose, let's say, or writes differently in order to convey new things. A couple I think of are, he likes to insult his enemies a lot. And that isn't very sportsmanlike or very philosophical, but he does it anyway. And the liveliness of the footnotes especially comes from endlessly insulting the people who pretend to understand capitalism but don't. But another way he does it is by, shifting perspectives or personifying. This is one of the other things he really captured in the translation, the moments of personification or the moments of speaking in the voice of the capitalist or the commodity. There's some passages where he speaks from the perspective of the commodity in order to really bring home the oddity of these things and how they work. Do you want to talk a little bit about the moments in which he speaks from the position of one of his characters?
Sure. So as you mentioned, there's a lot of interesting stuff that happens in this book around agency, and one of the points that Marx is really trying to make, and you could say that it was made by other political economists with the emphasis in Adam Smith, for example, on the invisible hand and let the market do its work and stand back. And Marx is emphasizing also in a different way, a much more critical way, that capitalism involves ceding agency, and that people, are not in control under capitalism. They're less in control even than they think they are. And this is one of the reasons why he talks about capitalism in terms of the fetish, because the fetish object in primitive religions, this was something that you made, and then you saw it as having, power over you. And this is what Marx thinks happens under capitalism, that people make these products, but because they don't come together in a rational way and plan out how much of what they need, they allow the market to regulate everything. And so even though you have vastly increased productive powers, you still have crises of underproduction and crises of overproduction. He sees this as being very much like the kind of primitive situation that 19th century people thought they had gotten behind. And he has a lot of different ways of expressing this upside down agency where things have more power and agency than people. He talks about, in one of his more famous formulations for what happens under capitalism, he talks about it as a situation where dead labor sucks the life out of living labor, and the more labor it sucks out of living labor, or the more it sucks living labor dry, the more it comes to life. But there are a lot of other ways in which he does this, employing language very creatively. And in thinking about the way in which this is a creative work, a work that has literariness, one of the passages that really has come to strike me a lot as being a particularly innovative passage. It comes in chapter 5, where Marx is talking about the labor process, and he has a capitalist manufacture yarn, and the capitalist doesn't manufacture yarn, doesn't make his worker work long enough to produce surplus value. For Marx, key idea at the center of all of this is that surplus value is produced by surplus labor, which is basically labor that the capitalist doesn't pay for. You do not have capitalism, according to him, without this, without the workday being divided into two parts, a part where necessary labor is performed, and during this part of the workday, the worker is producing value that replaces the value of the worker's labor power. And during the other part of the workday, the worker is working for the capitalist for free. That's where surplus value is being performed, and surplus value produces surplus labor. But capitalists don't really understand this most of the time, according to Marx. And so Marx, as a capitalist, do all the things you need to do to turn a profit, buys the capitalist controls the means of production. That's very important for capitalism in the modern form to exist. And the capitalism puts a wage laborer to work, someone who owns nothing except their labor power and has to sell their labor power as a commodity. Okay, these are important things for capitalism to work, but the capitalist, not understanding how surplus value comes about, doesn't have the worker work long enough to produce surplus value. The worker only works for one part of the workday, the part of the workday when the worker replaces the value of their labor power. And so the capitalist breaks even at the end of the day. And the capitalist is very upset, doesn't understand what has happened here. Why haven't I turned the profit and turned a profit? And instead of just saying that the capitalist is confused and angry, and then explaining again what the capitalist has missed, Marx has the capitalist speak, except that he doesn't have the capitalist give a monologue. He has the capitalist, he speaks basically through the capitalist using a form of narration, a kind of narrated monologue that's known as indirect free speech, that would become popular in German modernism, used to great effect by Franz Kafka, above all. And this is one of the earliest uses of this device in German letters, as far as I can tell. Interestingly, in the previous English translations, it's kind of effaced. So Marx has the capitalist, Marx tells you what the capitalist is thinking from a he perspective. Again, the capitalist doesn't hold a monologue. It's not an I perspective. It's a he perspective that's changed to an I perspective in the previous translations. This is something that basically never comes up in discussions of how my translation is different, other than when I talk about it. And it tells you something about how limited, unfortunately, discussions of translations can be. People tend to focus just on different word choices. If a term is one thing in the previous translations and something else in a new translation, they'll focus on that. Or they'll look at some famous lines, how they've been translated differently. But there are a lot of other decisions to be made about how to translate a work like this, and a lot of them don't get discussed. So what I'd like to do is just read that, instead of talking about the logic behind this use of free indirect discourse in capital, I thought I'd just give you the free indirect discourse, and then you can think, and now with you, I'm addressing the audience here, but also you, Paul, you can think about what may have driven Marx to invest his creative energy in this way. So here's the capitalist, upset about not producing surplus value, producing yarn, but not producing surplus value. Our capitalist, who is well versed in vulgar politically, I'll start again, excuse me, that's a little hard to say, vulgar political economy. Our capitalist, who is well versed in vulgar political economy, will perhaps say that he advanced money in order to make more money. But the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and he might just as well have intended to make money without producing a thing. He warns that he won't be caught off guard again. From now on, he will buy his commodity ready-made in the market instead of producing it himself. But if all his capitalist brothers were to do that, where in the market would he find his commodities? And he can't make a meal out of his money. He begins to sermonize. One should appreciate his abstinence. He could have frittered away his 15 shillings, but he spent them productively, using them to manufacture yarn, and he has yarn now rather than pangs of conscience. What he must not do is amass wealth by simply taking it out of circulation. We have seen what such asceticism brings. Not only that, where there is nothing, the emperor has lost his rights, and whatever the merit of the capitalist's act of renunciation may be, he can't be compensated for it because there is nothing to compensate him with. In this case, the process yields a product whose value merely equals the combined value of the commodities he put into it. Our capitalist might have found solace in the idea that virtue is its own reward, but instead he starts to raise his voice. The yarn is of no use to him. He made it in order to sell it. Thus he should sell it, or better yet, he should produce only things that satisfy his own wants and needs, a trusted therapy that McCulloch, his personal doctor, has prescribed against the epidemic of overproduction. Our capitalist becomes defiant and defensive, rearing up on his hind quarters. He asks, can a worker make commodities out of thin air simply by using his arms and legs? Didn't he supply his worker with the material the worker needed to embody his labor and in which his labor is thus embodied? Given that penniless persons make up the vast majority of society, hasn't our capitalist rendered an immeasurable service to society by providing the means of production, namely the cotton and the spindle? Hasn't he done the worker a great service too by giving him his means of subsistence? And shouldn't he get something in return for this service? But hasn't the worker, in fact, done our capitalist an equivalent service by turning the cotton and the spindle into yarn? Moreover, the notion of service is out of place here. A service occurs when a use value, whether a commodity or labor, exerts useful effects. But for the moment, however, what matters is exchange value. Our capitalist paid the worker value amounting to 3 shillings. The worker paid the capitalist back exactly the same quantity of value with the 3 shillings of value he added to the cotton, value for value. Our friend, who'd been cocky in the way of capital, suddenly takes on his worker's modest demeanor. Hasn't he worked too? Hasn't he performed the labor of overseeing, of managing the spinner? Shouldn't his work too generate value? The capitalist's own overlooker and his manager shrug at this. In the meantime, he has begun to grin broadly. His old expression is already back. His whole speech was just a ploy. Such discussions don't interest him at all. He will leave the lazy excuses and shallow arguments to the people who are paid to deliver them, professors of political economy. He's a practical man, and while he might not always know what he's talking about elsewhere, when it comes to business, he knows what he's doing.
What I hear in this passage is Marx skewering the capitalist, skewering him, our capitalist, all of this like patronizing language, the tone of like undercover ridicule as though you were at a party and you were smirking and you were talking about your neighbor. But then you're saying that the difference in this passage is that the capitalist doesn't speak in his own voice, in the subject position, using the pronoun I, but is spoken about by the author in such a way that it does what? It says, he does this, he does that, things that only the capitalist himself could know, really.
Hasn't he? Right. So we're getting the capitalist perspective, but we're not getting it directly. We're getting it indirectly, hence indirect free speech. And what does that do? Well, I think that, as you were saying, it creates a certain atmosphere of polite mockery that may be, especially devastating for being polite, right? This is not an easy form of narration to pull off. It's difficult, and a certain formality belongs to it. The sentences have to be constructed, very well in order for it not to be confusing. And I think that's there. I think, you find that in Kafka too.
So he's aping or pantomiming the capitalist, right? Inhabiting his skin, standing up and showing all his foolishness while keeping a little bit of distance.
Yes, yes, imitating the way the capitalist speaks, but there is also an interesting blending that goes on at times between Marx's perspective and the capitalist's perspective, and there are a couple of lines here where it's a little difficult to know which is which, and that's helps to create a certain kind of reader, a reader on their toes, an atmosphere of unstable agency where things are kind of gliding around, and we're not speaking from totally well-established subject positions.
And what do you think? So I see all that you're doing with this, and capturing it in that form is very close to what Marx was doing. Maybe it's the first time in English that you get this free and direct speech in these passages. But what does that do for a reader that the other translations don't do? That is to say, what good is it to have this effect for a reader of Capital? Don't we just want to know what value is?
Well, as you've emphasized many times, Marx is trying to criticize by any and every means necessary. And one way to do that is to lay out how value works, to lay out how capitalism is by nature exploitative. It's not a matter of there being some bad apples that you can get rid of. You can't reform the problem away because the problem comes from the core of capitalism. Get rid of exploitation and you get rid of capitalism. That's how Marx sees it. And he tries to, at times, lay that out in a pretty sober way, although frankly, he's kind of jokey there too. In fact, as he's revealing how surplus value works, there's a pretty funny joke about the Trinity. I think he's using humor all the time to try to bring readers along. He is aware of the cognitive demands of this book. And so that's part of it. You lose the effects that we just talked about when you lose the free and direct discourse. You also lose how hard Marx is working to try to bring the reader along. And I think that's important. I think that in the Fouts translation, he sounds way too much like someone, a Mandarin thinker, speaking from on high, droning on at times at a reader, whereas in the German, it's very clear all the time that he is working really hard for you. He wants you to understand it. He thinks this is urgently important. It's difficult. He's not going to simplify, but he's going to do lots of things to help bring you along. And that elicits goodwill, I think, from the worker that, doesn't happen so much in Paul's translation. Certainly, it can really make the difference between somebody coming along and not coming along, because obviously this is a book that a lot of people start reading and stop reading at a certain point and never finish.
The advertising for this book should be capital, funny for the first time.
I could think of worse things to say about the book, worse ways to present the book, for sure.
Should we turn to some questions, Catherine?
Yeah, I was going to say hi, and thank you so much.